I'd like to welcome you. Thank you all for coming. This is our fifth installment of the Critical Border Studies speaker series. This speaker series was started in September, and so far has been a resounding success. Today's speaker is Robert Latham, who is a former director of the York Center for International Security Studies, where he's now, I guess, just a fellow. Maybe, yeah. He's also an associate professor in the Department of Political Science here at York University, where he is also currently on research leave, and according to his title up there, he's found his way down to Ryerson, where he's a visiting faculty fellow at the Infoscape Center for the Study of Social Media. And today's talk will be screening the Borderlands, bodies, information, and the politics of anonymity across borders.
Okay, thank you, Chris. I'm going to start my timer. It's about 30-some-odd minutes or so, or it could be longer. Good.
Usually about 45.
Okay.
No more than 45.
Okay, cool.
Time.
Right, I understand. And I'm glad we're starting more or less on time. So, I guess the title may be kind of mysterious to you to some degree, and hopefully by the end make you feel it's less mysterious, though it may still remain that way to me. But at the most abstract and general level, my central interest is the relationship between bodies, mobility, and information. And the border is obviously a powerful site for the coming together of these three concepts, themes, dimensions, and such. And historically, obviously, I think it's obvious to me the emphasis has been on bodies and mobility. When we think of borders in particular, can bodies move, be present in a space, as in, let's say migrants in the United States. We all should be aware of the classic point about the movement of goods and services, whereas bodies move at best on a qualified, reluctant basis. Labor is wanted in places, but not persons per se. And what I have up here on the top, by the way, is the Cyberspace is a political spoof that captures this well. And it turns out that it's not so much of a spoof. It turns out there is actually some firms that are actually trying, in a way, to organize this notion. So it's around the notion of course, virtual migration. Basically, the idea is that we can have Mexicans working on the Mexican side of the border, moving machinery through their body in a kinetic way on the U.S. side of the border in order to pick things and do all sorts of work. But they themselves remain. Now, this has been started in the late 90s. This guy started this kind of this spoof notion, and then actually, as usual, just like the Occupy movement, firms and such pick it up and say, there's something to this. Can we actually do this technology? Would it make sense? So it was kind of set. So I think, but it does capture some of that notion. And those who might be familiar with a book by Anish Anish, someone I worked with years ago, called Virtual Migration, which actually was a focus, especially on the South Asian phenomena we've all become very, very familiar with in terms of the various call centers, but also outsourcing. And so in this paper, I'm focusing particularly on the relationship between information and mobility. And from the broad perspective, we can see the border as but one isolated, although very important site of information processing and production. So the relationship between movement and information occurs across spaces, not just across points or switches. Right? So, and information about position, and that's what I'm kind of talking about here, can be constantly generated at any point. Where someone is, where they are going, when they are doing it, and so on, where they're doing it. Now, this was all hatched in a most developed way. And those of you who come out of a communications background would know that cybernetics essentially really developed this very, very clearly in the 40s. An example is the tracking of the movement of planes, coordination of missiles and artillery. So basically, it's that notion that at any given time you can mathematically map the movement of something as well as the trajectory of it going forward. And just as an aside, though I should be careful about them because of my time limits, there's actually a firm which is supposedly taking the entire web and trying to predict all forms of future scenarios on any given person's group activity based on an actual correlation of every possible information they can actually glean in massive server farms and such. So, it's a kind of just an extension of the same thing. So the entire world of electronic communications is actually being moved by states and corporations towards this sort of tracking of information, as well as bodies. So, and we can add, of course, civil society in that picture. We can think of WikiLeaks as a way of a kind of, civil society-based form of the attempt to sort of track information, bring information together. We know the hundreds of thousands of documents that are in play. So from a different angle, it's different in many ways. I won't go into it, but we have to understand there's actually forms of continuity there. So I just want to, first, as way of background, I mean, my talk today in part builds, so I won't go into it, but I should make this clear where I'm coming from, on something that developed in the a year or two ago and was published in 2005 in a piece called Border Formations, a concept called mediated passage, and it was really meant, in a sense, I had done work and been involved in the whole digital identity management movement early on in the New York area and such, the idea that people should be able to control their identity and the information that they have and such. So the idea that I was it occurred to me that, well, we think of the border is this profoundly unmediated relationship between the state and the migrant, or in the broadest sense of the term migrant. We stand before them in every possible kind of open way. We are, right, and we're all familiar with that. So it occurred to me, well, why would we have to accept that as the way passage takes place? Why can't we, in a sense, mediate that through organizations that could actually control the information on your basic preferences? So I would then partner with an organization, say, look, I would want you to present my passage, in effect. Here's what I want seen, here's what I don't want seen, so on. I mean, this is, so you'd actually have, this is what some of the digital identity notions are, which we don't have that now in the system. What we have is Facebook colonizing digital identity with Facebook Connect. They've taken over the logic of this, the idea that you control identity through them. But the original idea is that, and there are some of these civil society organizations around that would actually, you would give them, in a sense, here's what I want. I have a personal relationship with you. You can actually, I want to be presented this way. I want these companies to only see this little bit. I want these people. I want the U.S. government to only see this piece of information about. So this is all possible. It's just it never happened for lots of reasons. It would be a whole different talk. But the people are there and the motive is there. But it's since the momentum has been somewhat colonized by the companies that actually were brought on board. But I think we can do the same thing in terms of the border, and it doesn't occur to me why we can't do that to create that. And actually, I was heartened to actually meet in Mexico recently one of the leading organizations, which is a very independent organization, working especially with young youth that are crossing the border, who actually started to talk about what we could do to actually begin to implement these notions, so it doesn't end up falling into a kind of a trap of contracting. And what we don't want in this sort of context is the state contracting those. It has to be the exact opposite. Authority has to be with the organizations, and then the state, would work with them. So I won't go into all the detail, but this is kind of partly for the motivation here, and what media passage is all about undermining direct exposure. So I'm specifically interested, particularly in this talk, paper, and so on, in the tension between evasion and exposure. More generally, and so one of my main questions is, how does evasion and exposure matter specifically around the border, and more broadly as a basis for understanding a certain kind of politics? So we might most easily think of this in terms of the logic of detection, right? Border crossings, or ICE, narcos, or cartels, that are in contrast to the logic of the shadows, clandestine migration, shadow markets, invisible governance, if not also shadow states, pirating, smuggling, weapons, cars, cash software, passwords, cybercrime, and all these sort of things. So technology is understood to aid both evasion and exposure, sort of evasion in the sense of hiding behind digits and false identities, but also aids exposure, let's say the detection of illicit flows, the outing of secret government programs in the name of transparency, WikiLeaks, Lulz, and so on, which I'll talk a little bit about later. Looking here, of course, we know that drones are now moving across the U.S. border, I mean, across the expanse. What we have here, in a sense, is this notion of detecting, finding tunnels, and there's a whole whole new program around this. But at the same time, what I like about this is not only this notion of the exposing the tunnel, but the fact that tunnel itself is an effort itself, right, to evade. And then, of course, the Anonymous, which is obviously, I think, it's obvious to me, but is quite active in Mexico, actually. And there's been a lot of interesting developments. But there was an attack on the websites of the Mexican government on the holiday September 15th that they have in Mexico. And, of course, we know the threats here regarding Occupy Toronto or such, the same concept. So, this, we have to put this in a couple of perspectives. I mean, consider how important anonymous sources have been for journalism, of course, right? I mean, it's very critical. There's also a long tradition of seeing anonymity as liberating. Possibilities to invent oneself, explore, be a stranger in the city. There's a long social theory, sociological tradition there. Safety from abusive state and civil society organizations. So obviously the motives for anonymous, is that it is to evade, to avoid, to not be busted, basically. And there are people that take a different approach to, as I put it, digital activism, which is through a much more transparent approach. And digital means various forms of online sit-ins and so on, which have been associated with people like Ricardo Dominguez and such, and the Critical Art Ensemble. So we have a whole tradition there. Now we should note that anonymity has also been thought of as an impoverished way of life, right? I mean, lost on the edge, hiding, in contrast to anonymity is liberating, right? I mean, so the example I'll give an example of sort of some of how these things are being taken. I mean, the United States has a program called E-Trace, which is the internet-based system that lets the U.S. Marshal a lot of Latin American countries to actually find gun lists. So they're, in a sense, using this as a way to actually enter into the system across the border, within the societies, using the excuse of gathering information on guns. We know from our own controversy here how much is at stake in this actual question of chasing guns, what it means to chase, and so on. So the use of exposure in contrast to evasion, I think we have to realize that migrants expose themselves to many things, violence, right-wing attacks, heat in the desert, and so on, and they evade lots of things when they expose themselves, let's say, a border. So evasion and exposure are not meant to be antonyms per se, but contrasting logics. I want to make that clear, even as they do overlap. So I'm going to turn to some of the sort of spacing here. I don't know how much you can see this. I don't think you can see it very well, but and there's no reason to go over this in any detail, but it was just sort of an attempt, for my own help to kind of do a mapping here. We have is if we think of the borderlands in the broad sense of the term, and we can think in many ways what we mean by borderlands, but typically it's meant in the spatial terms, the hundreds of miles around the border. It's meant in a kind of discursive cultural sense of the world of thinking about the border. So, I'm assuming most people are familiar, but we're not obviously talking about just the very, very tight line and the tight meeting of the abutment of two countries. So there's the physical notion of borderlands, which is, we have from the state to the spaces in the towns that are across each other, Nuevo Laredo in Texas, and, we have the transparent migration, the legal, the sort of well-behaved, the desired migration. We have clandestine coyotes, narcos. We have the anti-immigrant activists, also, migrants already in the U.S. that are mobilized and connected. Then, obviously, on the electronic side, and I just go through this quickly, we can think of, in a sense, and I'll go through a lot of these, from the electronic border, the so-called virtual border, which has been problematic, but however is still alive, is a serious program, but has taken a different route and much more in the sort of private security realm. Mobile phones, Twitter, activist technologies like, I'll describe it, the TransBorder immigrant tool. They have hometown sites, and again, I don't know who is familiar with what here completely, but those are the towns that are in Mexico that, in a sense, are not only serving their own town, but are serving the that broader local diaspora, typically in the U.S., and you can have finding information and so on. We have the anti-narco and forums, which I'll get to. But we also have narco, the actual cartels, I should say, cartel uses of the web, which I'll get to. So the space is actually when you think about it, it's pretty complicated. And I can't go into all of these, but I'll get to some of this now. But I'm less interested. I want to make clear at this point in the electronic face of transnationalism per se, from transborder social movements around undocumented migrants to the hometown associations. And here's an example of a hometown association. This is one town, so you can see the kind of thing that you find if you went in there. You would find all sorts of information and maybe ways of making money and sending money that are done through that. There's different types of cards, purchasing products. There's a lot of services electronically out there. So I'm less interested in that. This on the left here is a example of the sort of, which I find interesting from the standpoint of exposure, an idea of particularly students that have come out have come out and that are saying we're undocumented and so on. So and we'll talk about 2006 a little bit, but this is an ongoing, pretty well developed movement among young people, in universities in the U.S. On the upper right is another interesting example, which we can't forget, which is this very Monterey Tech Institute, which is a Mexican tech, as it's called down there, that reaches across the Southwest into the U.S. We have this sort of transnational organization. It's a higher education. It's a typical corporatization of higher ed model. They're out throughout. They're opening up all over Arizona, New Mexico. They're everywhere. Texas. I mean, they're massively present. They're a huge growth industry. They provide the kind of polytechnique sort of stuff. And it's another sort of form of transnationalism that we can't forget. So we also could talk about remittances and so on. We have purchase cards, transnational purchase cards, cyber bride services. I mean, there's a whole sling of things that I could go through that would count as transnationalism per se. So I'm not. These are important, very important, and you can see from the picture on the left side that they do bear on evasion and exposure, very much the idea of coming out. But I'm trying to keep the focus on developments around the border as a central object, per se. So I'm not dismissing these things in any sense, but I'm just focusing a bit. Now, the state, of course, continues, as I mentioned, to expand its technology-based programs, despite the abandonment of the Secure Borders Initiative, SBI, that some of you might be familiar with. These firms are lining up in all kinds of ways. Money spent on drones, as we mentioned, biometrics, a whole bunch of things going on. The Southwest Border Initiative, SWI, on the left, is an example of a Motorola study to develop command and communication systems. So the idea that you would take the border and use the models of military command and communication. And I'll get back to some of these other dimensions of militarization. We've all been talking about it for a long time, but I think be careful what you talk about. You may find you get it in a much higher dose in the little bits you've seen, occasional deployment of troops. There's a lot more going on now in this way. So this is an example of a kind of like the use of command and control. I don't know how many are familiar. This idea of certain types of communication, who speaks to whom, when, and where, and very, very contained and such. So that's what's going on in that state. And we also have, of course, a program, that is also regarding fingerprints that would reach, in this case of El Paso, a sort of much, much higher, far greater than anything we've seen before around the use of digital fingerprints about everybody who's passing in Australia. So that's also clearly very much in the system. So we shouldn't overlook, so this idea of, for example, private prisons is another area that's coming in a big way on the border. Corrections Corporation of America, has been the major benefactor of all the deportations and such, and for holding pens and such. They're doing very well in that area as well as other areas regarding corrections. So I want to talk about just for a minute, as we know that the panic about the border is not just about clandestine migration, but the drug cartels which are taken to thrive on evasion, right? Shadow economy, I mentioned the smuggling, and now they're even saying they're the major cyber crime forces, and this is going to dwarf everything, forget about drugs, I mean, this is the major business. And of course, so this is what they're seeing in terms of Mexico as this kind of threat. And all this is fueling this sense of crisis at the border and deepening the public anxiety. So cartels are then seen as sort of push factors that are creating refugees. As you see on the left slide, this is this like a Exodus research program, right? You can see the play there. So web, of course, the web used to reveal a world that was otherwise hidden. In this case, it's a world of migration from Mexico that is really once revealed, now to understand as a refugee, as a refugee action, right? So now there's a new way of creating this, and we know that there have been all sorts of claims and so on, but now they're talking about particularly middle class, upper middle class people. It's a reframing, but we understand, even though there's at one level the sympathy around this refugeehood, there's also the other side of it, as we already know, the question of the creation of the panic and the public anxiety around that. So it kind of obviously it plays into that, which then creates the resistance to any sort of refugeehood and such, right? So it becomes a horrible circle. Now, there's also more generally this world of security threats on the border that are in need of being addressed. On the right, there's this very recent strategy study written by General Barry McCaffrey, who, I don't know if you remember this name, probably vaguely some of you do, and I don't know if Chris does or not, but this was the guy, he was a notorious U.S. military and security kind of actor. He was in the Gulf War I, and Cy Hirsch from the New Yorker accused him of war crimes, and he was also, that didn't stop him from being appointed the drug czar of the United States by Clinton. Why should it? And his office was actually accused of using domestic propaganda. They were trying to steer media into certain messages and actually put subliminal messages in. And this isn't just conspiratorial stuff. The U.S. Government Accountability Office actually found him guilty of violating the domestic propaganda restrictions. So this guy was hired by the state of Texas to come up with a militarized approach to the border for far greater than what we've ever known and imagined. And the idea is to treat the zone, the space, as a war zone. Simple as that. It's a war zone, and drug war might be as well, taken for a land power issue in a sense. If you see, I'll go into this company, which takes me to this Colgin company, and which is who he's working for. And this, this connects back, as I mentioned, to the private security angle. It's quite prominent now along the border. It's interesting that the state like Texas, and this is who was basically behind the report. I find it, a bit troubling. So a state like Texas is hiring a defense consulting firm made up of former Pentagon bigwigs. They have a headquarter in Texas, but it's interesting. It's also seen to be virtual headquarters. So obviously, most of their action is in Washington. So I don't know what's up with that, but it's. I'd like to find out some more. But it's quite. So we can imagine these are the type of figures that are involved with this. Kind of. We know what happens when generals retire, right? They can make a lot of trouble in the world. So they don't just sit and talk on MSNBC. So we may well be just at the starting stage of this kind of notion, unless there's some kind of fight back on it. Now, I want to also focus a bit on the bottom-up production of panic, also, right? And so we're looking at more state and corporate organized forms or generated forms. And here's an example of this personal participatory media that is up there. It's mapping the cartel deaths across Mexico, and I see an example of how they're using this visual sense of crisis, and helping produce this kind of social anxiety that we're talking about. And I'll come to a number of them. This is just one instance, and of course, you can sometimes find the identity, but we have to be careful, who's behind things. Again, the evasion theme comes out, and who is what and who is where. But of course, we're all familiar that it is. There is a real serious, very serious problem in Mexico around cartels. It's in the news all the time. But it's I was just there for a few weeks and working with a lot of people, and there's only a few areas left that are not even affected by it in a profound way. So, but be that as say, the other question is what this has to do with the U.S. In fact, the U.S. towns are completely devoid of any sort of thing, right? So it's not crossing in any sort of serious way. Another way of seeing this also this kind of kind of participatory notion, which can take form in different ways and become instances of panic and anxiety. We take something the cell phone, this very normal thing that it kind of becomes made dangerous. What we have here is this threat on a famous sheriff in Arizona, who of course was very controversial, and this was something put out and basically saying I think quite a lot of money, $1 million for the killing of this guy. Now how real this was, what the source was, so on, another question, right? More important is the resonance of it and how it was taken up by the media and all kind of things of that sort, and discussed and became, in Arizona, and I've spoken to a number of people there, like a friend of mine, Spike Peterson. She said, this was a huge deal down there. So it's an issue of, why the source. Of course, we always have to be skeptical of that. But of course, the other side of it is, why it could be just about anything and could be real is the cartels are very involved online, and they doing kind of forms of exhibition, YouTube stuff. I mean, there's a kind of, I mentioned the Mexico moves into cybercrime notion, but this is consumed by publics in the U.S. and Mexico, so it's sort of contributing to this public anxiety and this perverse support for cartels. Of course, we know that the corridos, the songs and the things, right? I don't know if you know this popular culture around the cartels, and this shaping image of life at the border that is part of this amplifier effect that happens. So the cartels are interesting because they are basically very evasive, but at the same time they have this other interesting theme of really expository. They're really exposing themselves in all kind of really bizarre ways. An example, why would they publish this list? Of course, we know there are all kind of strategic effects on the upper right-hand corner. So, quita puercos kind of means, I think it's like removal of pigs. Kind of like we're going to take these pigs out. Basically, is what on the upper right is what it kind of it's a kind of neologism. There's a list of people. If you're really going to kill these people, do you tell everybody who you're going to kill ahead of time? So it's all kind of bizarre performances that are going on, and amplifications, and why and how the motivations are is not clear. But that's another example of this kind of this desire to expose, and why would you want to create more public anxiety, about this sort of thing? When in fact you have, that mobilizes the public support to want to have the military, the ones that are and the police that still actually may help and not be totally colonized by the cartels to actually do something. We also have an instance of the heroes mapped in Juarez, basically, which complements the sort of mapping of deaths, actually. And these people who otherwise, may be in trouble would help a child, someone who would help put someone away from the cartels, or help a kid who was passaging from Guatemala through Mexico. So this is someone who's actually kind of mapping these heroes. Now, of course, they remain anonymous, and some people call this, citizen journalism. Interesting dynamic. You're exposing good deeds, but you're actually keeping them anonymous per se. It shows that not all forms of kind of exposure are necessarily productive of anxiety. And it's sort of like a public sphere in some way. I see it connected to the notion of mediated passage in that, it allows for public action, but on an anonymous basis. So building trust on an anonymous basis. I'll stop here on this element. Now, we can also extend this to see social media as a form of survival and resistance to narco violence. Another example of personal participation in the media, logics of exposure in the name of human security. On the left, we have Nuevo Laredo on Vivo, Nuevo Laredo Live. These are, by the way, different. These are ways that basically people are posting, in effect, information saying that, 2 p.m. down at the Zocalo, there's going to be the cartel is going to be there. We heard that. They're posting information that's very useful. In fact, there's one piece that is up that is actually in English. I happened to find it was a U.S. consul in Laredo has received reports cartels have blocked the highway, blah, 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 right? So this is a kind of, one thing that's been going on there is this notion that the media, public media, is completely useless because they're either totally fearful of reprisal, and there's been lots of reasons for feeling that, lots of deaths of journalists, or they're in the payment of the cartel. So, basically what people have done is self-organize and, to give the information they need. And as we know, the state itself is captured in many, many dimensions by the cartels. And, so who are you going to trust, right? I mean, it's kind of, and who are you going to trust here? But yet people have used this, and it's been, I've been told, useful. And this, of course, there's a blog, Del Narco, actually, that posts videos and stories about cartel actions. So it's the opposite side of this, that, some accused of actually serving the interests of cartels, to kind of publicize their prowess and exploit, but again, create fear, right? So, which may be the reason why one would put names of who you're going to kill. Maybe you don't really want to kill them, but you just want to show that. So, so what we have here is a sort of, massive effort on the way this year to actually break anonymity and stop anti-cartel bloggers and posters by intimidation. And supposedly hackers were hired to find the identities of media producers, these kind of bloggers. And what you see is an example of two. I purposely have a very small picture there because it's very graphic, and I've sometimes covered that picture. But I felt at my home base I don't have to cover it. When I've shown it in Mexico, I've covered it. I mean, you can pay someone off to find out who. Right? All I have to do is go to an ISP and say, I want to know who's posting this. Can you trace it? Of course they can trace it. So how much dollars later they've got a name, got an address. I mean, even using all of your anonymity efforts, right? So there is no anonymity all the way down, so to speak. There's only kind of surface, and right? No one can ever truly be anonymous. Someone can get you for sure. And so these supposedly were 2 young people who were killed. There's been other killings, even one as recently as about a week ago. On the right is a sign that was left by a blogger in Laredo whose online identity was Nida Laredo, who was kind of woman of Laredo, and she basically the sign says, I'm the Laredo Girl, and I'm here because of my reports and stuff, and you're you don't want to believe me, and this happened to me because of what I did, and and believing in the Army and the Navy. So thank you. And ZZZ is, of course, the Zetas, who are the most notorious cartel around. They're the ones that are based on former special ops commandos from the Mexican, basically, military that have kind of bolted, started their cartel. So there's other cartels and such, but they're the ones that are actually, in terms of this ratcheting up of violence, they're the main factors, and obviously they're very good at it, for most of the reasons. And they also understand information in ways differently than I think the other cartels understood it, because we know U.S. military is trained. I mean, the U.S. has been involved in, for decades in this whole notion of information warfare and such, and the Mexican military is trained by the U.S. military. The manuals are from the U.S. basically. So I would like to speak a few minutes about some aspects of the micro practices of the border, which are most vividly, I think, manifest in the mobile phone use, which is really the ultimate kind of micro technology, at least in terms of what we use every day. We, of course, nano and all, but for our use at this point, this is it. And one way this gets manifest in public, often fearful senses, is imagination of the notion of the mobile phone, our everyday thing, can be used by evaders, smugglers, coyotes, the way Citizen Band, those of you who may remember or who have looked back at the Citizen Band radios in the 70s were used to evade police traps or other kind of traps, but, to catch you. It was, there's a whole interesting culture on the CB radio, but quite similar in a way in terms of reporting information. Cell phones have a lot more power in a way. So this play between technology evasion is not just about the cartels; it's also about this migration process, right? So the cyber coyote, right? This idea. This is the New York Times, so obviously it's gives it a certain imprimatur. And the cyber coyote is this use of technology to facilitate clandestine migration. So as an aside, what I see in play here is a kind of practice of foster evasion that really uses this logic of exposure, right? You're exposing where the police are. It's a sort of technology of counter-detection, right? So what gets interesting to me is that the very effort to track, let's say, Border Patrol, like to track them, to say, oh, there's Border Patrol down there, don't go down that way, leaves them vulnerable to being tracked themselves because you have the triangulation of cell towers, right, that are very important. And if you leave your cell phone on for any time, GPS even off, you can be easily found. Your position is very easily detected. So it's not even a question of GPS. That's all another matter. So it's sort of some interesting dynamics there. Now, of course, from the other direction, or I would say other, but from a different direction, the TransBorder immigrant tool, which is basically cell phone that there's a GPS in there that it allows it to connect to see where depots of water are positioned. So clandestine migrants can actually know that the border angels or humane borders people and so on that leave the water out and various other things that help people who are going now through the desert because the cities are basically shut down completely, so everybody's stuck with the desert in terms of crossing. This helps you find those things, and then the phone shuts off immediately. I've spoken to a car, they ask us question of, well, okay, they're going to get tracked. I mean, but no, the phone will go off immediately, and that's it. It's a kind of almost one-time use thing. And if you don't keep it on long enough, it's very hard. They have to actually know that you're there to find you. So if you don't keep it on very long, so it's almost a one-time thing, it's very unlikely without a massive kind of surveillance net, which doesn't exist yet, though that's what they wanted with the virtual border. You can't really find someone. So I think, and of course, there was a guy, Reverend Robin Hoover, of the Humane Borders, who actually years ago was thinking about these phones and actually is distributing them, and similar to stuff to the Dominguez team, and actually Hoover's happy to give them the coyotes as well, because the idea is that, well, if you can help everybody survive who's in your party, then that's a good thing from a humane standpoint. So when you have to think about how this TBT, as it's called, figures in, a tool to aid evasion that makes sort of the environment more transparent and gives information to migrants in contrast to the Border Patrol or the coyotes or the narcos. Now, another way mobile phones have been used is to expose supposedly the reality of violence at the border. So a boy was killed in Juarez, and the video from a phone cast doubt on whether he was throwing rocks and provoking an attack, even if we thought that from throwing rocks would actually should have provoked an attack. That aside, even the guards are allowed to use guns. Actually, by the regulations that they work under, the Border Patrol, is that they can use guns against a rock attack. So the question is, was he even doing that? Putting aside that question of whether that is a legitimate rule, but against the rock attack. The question if there was no rock attack. Now, supposedly the video was showing, that they were also on the Mexican side. So what were they doing there? If this was an issue, if you're there, someone's going to throw rocks at you. And we know that the U.S. Border Patrol constantly crosses them, and if they come into Canada kind of willy-nilly, all of a sudden they don't want to cross. I mean, I've had students who are, members of the our border services, and they tell me all the time, all of a sudden these guys with bristling guns come running across the border and decide they're going to, so this is happening. You can imagine that's Canada, what's going on there in that respect. So this raises a sort of broader question about what might someone witness or tell the world when is witnessing at the border. I'd also, another way to look at this, though, of course, everybody's doing a lot of this sort of thing. All the different political parties in play and mobilized groups, and that's sort of finding holes in the fence here, right? There's a whole movement on the web of using Google Earth to say, oh, look, there's a hole there, right? Because we know how good Google Earth is in that way. So this has been a game afoot, and the kind of the reaction to it is, of course, build the border fence as a movement. This is Arizona government, right? State government. Look on the upper right. Basically, they've got some fair amount of money, and here's this provocative picture, And you're supposed to give money, so you not only will you be the surveiller in such kind of bottom up surveiller, but you'll actually give money and help make the fence. You work together to do this. I mean, government can't deliver them. Damn, we're going to do it ourselves, right? So of course, another side of this also is the Texas Agriculture Commissioner named Todd Staples has a website that is putting testimonials up and other information. He also commissioned, by the way, the war zone border report, by the way. So it's the other side. He's got a human side here, which is the testimonials, first-hand accounts of negative experience in the borderland, of farmer ranchers and these kind of things. So here we see the non-anonymous exposures, the personalization of the border from a fear standpoint. And of course, we're more used to these personal stories of migrants, typically. Actually, if you read something like David Spencer, there's also people, the personal experience from the other side. So this is the different side, and the idea of you using the same thing we see as facilitating, the web and various and other types of electronic communications in this other direction. And Staples also website is kind of it's interesting sort of place, but I can't go into details. As I see my time is running short. So this blue circle is another thing, citizen surveillance with cameras at the border. Who needs a virtual fence when you have thousands of vigilant citizens observing, sitting at their computer monitors, watching away. In other words, there's cameras. Those of you who look at the cameras for traffic, right? With Toronto traffic, what's going on in the garden or question. Well, it's the same notion. They have cameras all over. We know what's going on with the Canadian border. One of the ideas is putting cameras in all kinds of places across in the forests and the parks. So this is all over in the Southwest. So you're supposed to sit there and watch it like a SETI. Those of you know SETI, the outer space. So it's a similar kind of notion, blue servo. So it's they're kind of getting involved in all kind of ways, citizens, like aiding them, monitoring them. So the next slide comes up with this thing called the interesting little kind of action and arts, aesthetic program called the Border Haunt. And the Haunt, they were tempted to swarm the blue servo, the kind of observers, right? The citizen observers of the border, to undermine their efforts by creating a database of the names of those who died crossing, which is quite extensive, and loading it onto the blue servo servers. And so that was a kind of, like you see down here in the bottom, over 2,000 migrant deaths have been recorded on the U.S. border since 2008. Lots of people have been involved. So the idea that it's kind of like a digital sit-in, but you basically try to take out the blue servo effort. More importantly, you try to reinscribe its meaning. You try to reinscribe and reframe it around these questions as opposed to the other ones that they're busy with. Another way this effort that I'm coming towards the end, electronic sit-in and swamp-ins to overrun the operations of a campaign, and not just alter their media, right? And it's actually undermine the whole thing. And this was done in a transparent way. In the U.S., it's supposed to be legal to protest like this online, the way you would protest in an urban park, right? I mean, you should be able to enter in. And so this was the Minutemen. They have their Southwest Action to Resist the Minutemen, and this is the actual. So this was a group, but obviously again, it runs out of kind of various movements of the digital arts, resistance, and such. On the right is the actual Minutemen, Campbell Minutemen. That are busy, and you can see the various pictures. Of course, here's the observing picture of the busy sense, not just the question of arms, but and so they attempt to take them down in some way, and so the alternative to the more transparent collective effort that I just referred to there, with the swarming, let's say, is a collective effort to undermine the power at the border world. Is the anonymous effort associated with Lulzsec, right? Lulzsec is the name for Lulz, which is a variation on laugh out loud, and then sec for security. So what they did in this effort is attack and put on Pirate Bay information about manuals and Arizona law enforcement effort, profiling stuff on military efforts, apprehension, and so on. So a lot of stuff that you necessarily wouldn't want to see exposed. And so this is, of course, non-transparent way of conflict, but also has this double side of obviously transparency to expose that this goes on. And so obviously those who would take this, if they were apprehended, would be seen as doing something illegal, evading privacy, evading top secret government things and such, right? So we also have a case of hacking the emails of a corporate executive involved in developing border weapons and cybersecurity strategies for a firm called Vanguard Defense Industries. And, again, private security pops up. This executive was also a member of InfraGard, which is very important secret law enforcement, military, and private sector collaboration to share security information, especially around the border, which many fear is a form of kind of private sector spying and snitching to the state, right? So those of you familiar with cases about Google and things, this is going on in all kind of very bizarre ways. So, of course, the logic is very clear in the anonymous website. We invade in order to expose. So, quest for clandestine migrants is we evade to gain access. So there's different kind of logics that play in this. So in this slide, we see documentation of a sort of border patrol riot, not against no border camp, right? A no border camp event. They happen in different places all around the world, but they've had a few on the U.S.-Mexican border. So they act politically to protest in public. You are obviously very, very vulnerable to exposure. Kind of, you wear your V mask, let's say, or cross into a physical space. You can obviously be very easily outed. However, online, as I said, there's no such thing as anonymity all the way down. So they're going to get you. I think we have to realize that young hacktivists are really no match for full-time, quite extensive, well-resourced anti-hacker cybersecurity organizations. The way that people who are protesting, there was like about 100 border guards and such, and they had a kind of riot. We're not familiar with these things. For happening case all over, they freak out and they start going. They start doing all sorts of things. So at the same time, things can happen in electronic spaces. And the only thing working in the favor of the hacktivists is the element of surprise and inventiveness, right? I mean, the state and the corporate structures of security are mostly reactive, though we can't say things about their efforts to create intellectual property structures and such that are not are framing, but that's another story. So now one aspect of physical resistance and protest is the violence that is used against you is something that you or others can at least document to further expose abusive action, as we see here, as the pictures of this, the kind of videos kind of show this. We see this today, obviously, in the sites that are focused on the Occupy movements. It's been very powerful right from the beginning. And, of course, what it means and what the effects are is another matter. This doesn't really, cyber activism, of course, doesn't have that. When they're identified, they're arrested. So I suspect that this deepens the tension between my physical and electronic spaces, in that the stakes of the physical and electronic are amplified with events and more protests over more days, for example, in either space, feeding into the other in a kind of loop, in a sense. And distribution of videos of, let's say, border patrol riots means that if you are the police, you must end the physical presence, even using violence to do so, as we see in New York, to stop the possibility of more such videos and violations, right? So it gets in these really horrible feedback effects, so anything to move things on and so on. So just my conclusions one question that falls, I think, directly for me is whether the anonymity or the anonymous approach represents the way to be political, and we should think of migrants in terms of the anonymous approach. At the same time, denying that the state from its own kind of rendering practices, territory, bodies, and identities, that is just a matter of survival or the creation of a new politics. So, of course, the right wing, we know, in the U.S. Does tend to hide its identity oftentimes, let's say in the web and other places, and we know the police have always hiding their identity too. But again, they're consonant with state agendas for the most part, and it's only when they get into the really extreme physical violence that we see any sort of serious evasion. The cartels, death squads, violent extremists with guns and bombs, right? But it's along the other direction you don't see it. So I want to consider if we should see the anonymity of clandestine migration in terms of a politics in a sort of way. I mean, a sociologist, Nestor Rodriguez, looks at the migration as something analogous to the autonomy movement in Italy, self-autonomy of workers, organizing, associated. They say Negri was involved with this in ways. It's very much anti-state power, anti-capital, but without necessarily top-down programming, right, around certain reorganizing society. So even if we assume no self-conscious political resistance, as the vast inequalities and restrictions often called by observers, like Joseph Nevins talk about, the question is, are we ascribing, to some do, like kind of Rodriguez does, a kind of politics to crossing, to violating in some way, right? I mean, but are we ascribing too much is, of course, a question to this inadvertent resistance, if we can call it that, right? I mean, a clandestine crossing. To something better seen as a kind of micro-logics of, say, the pursuit of human security, a better life, return to the family, and so on. I mean, Howard Campbell and Joshua Heyman, if you're familiar with their work, think that we are sort of pushing too much on that, and they question the depth and resonance of any resistant politics of border crossing. Right? But I would go further in questioning this actually, and kind of ask the question of I would go further by basically trying to wonder whether we are ascribing an inadvertent politics in border crossing, that we actually are trying, in a sense, when we yet again trying to be political, forcing migrants to be a certain way, right? I mean, this is a question, academics, activists want it to be that way. And, we say, they're defying two states, they're defying Mexico, they're doing ways of defying the U.S., right? So at the same time, there's some way we're imposing a notion of it. So it's not just a question of they are not doing. What is the politics of our own reading of them as doing something of that sort? I have some problems with that in the way that we do that. So we saw in 2006, actually, that migrants can step out into partial exposure as a mass to take the streets, and they can choose to be political as opposed to be told that they are political, above their heads. And by being anonymous together, they can actually open up a space for more such actions. In other words, rather than just look for ways to expand the exposure of migrants, meaning, to state law and various forms of surveillance, we can look into ways to build a politics, and dare say even types of dimensions of social order around anonymity that fully engages migrants who can have agency over how they are presented and represented. And maybe that would also translate into how the border is presented and represented. So the 2006 demonstration suggests to me that there may be something in the effort to build on mass public anonymity. Individuals should, control their identity and the relationship of their identity to the state. So why not begin to see evasive mobility as an act toward freedom? Grassroots civil society should seek to begin to kind of govern mobility and secure security of presence from below, to take on the sort of hyper-nationalist right wing that is against this, that only really, I think, works as a state, seeks to act like a state, basically. That's how I see the right wing in this area. So electronic and kind of cultural spaces are where alternative meanings, obviously, of the Borderlands can be produced and fought over. And there's been some interesting art projects, by the way. Insight, for example, on Tijuana. Migrants, we know, have little access and often limited literacy, but they need to be producers and governors of these realms. So I say need to, because I think the knowledge and claim of production around the border, which is mostly done actually electronically, is not something that can be left only to experts and officials, hobbyists, academics, and such. Thanks.